Thank you everyone for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Recruit Smart, Develop Smarter, from skills-based hiring to systems that make skills grow. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing at a later time. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to utilize the chat function and they will be addressed as the presentation allows. Today's Lunch and Learn is presented by Wasac's Gold partner, BerryDunn. BerryDunn collaborates with local governments at the enterprise level, as well as within and across departments to meet the most critical needs of your community, emphasizing principles of equity and engagement. I'm excited to introduce you to BerryDunn's organization development team members, Michelle Kennedy and Traquillia Kennedy, who will be exploring what it actually takes to build a workforce strategy that works in today's presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for being here. It's been about a year ago since BerryDunn conducted a lunch and learn on a similar topic, the silver tsunami, which is connected to our topic today. This is building on our January 2026 WASAC article, newsletter article about advancing local government through skill-based recruitment, which is a really important tool to being able to manage the silver tsunami. I mean, the problem is simply local governments are facing a talent crisis. You've experienced this directly, I'm sure. It's both structural and cultural. And some of the solutions are going to require rethinking two things at once. Number one, how do we bring people in? And then once we get them, what are we doing with them? So I'm Michelle Kennedy from BerryDunn. I'm a senior manager in BerryDunn's local government practice group with an expertise in organization development. We actually have a workforce development and talent development service line, which Traquillia leads. My background is 30 years as a consultant serving local government, and I actually came out of government before I became a consultant. We work with local governments all over the country, and this is one area that every single one of our clients is telling us about as we try to help them plan strategically for their futures. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to have Traquillia introduce herself, and then we'll get into the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Really appreciate that intro. A little bit more about me. I am a senior consultant at BerryDunn, same practice group, local government, and our enterprise organizational development. I have more than 16 years in HR and OD experience. I've led in the HR function, it's across change management, in the OD space as well, from nonprofit to healthcare, education, and now focusing on more of the public sector with local government, BerryDunn with our talent development unit. And so really wanted to focus on the systems as we look at, how do we kind of start to move away from or start to develop our recruitment processes and look at kind of a systems function and just focus on that perspective versus the training events component, and talk about how do we get people to stay once we get them in the door. We have the silver tsunami that is kind of shifting, and we have people who are, we have a change within our climate. Our generations are kind of moving forward. So how do we get people in? And once we get them in, how do we get them to stay?
Great.
Right. I'll turn that over to Michelle.
Yeah, so now we're going to get into the content. And I just encourage you all, if you have questions while we're going through the material, we like engagement. We actually have some questions we're going to pose back to you. So if you have questions, either raise your hand, use the raise hand function, and we'll respond to them real time, or you can put them in the chat, and we'll either answer them there, or we'll bring them up to the group and have discussion. So please feel free to do that. You don't have to save your thoughts and your questions until the end. So we are deep in the silver tsunami. And you're probably aware of this. You've probably experienced it directly. This is hard data that came from a 2024 survey, a local and state government workforce survey. So it's pretty recent. Mission Square actually updated in 2025 and 2024 this data. 38% of the total workforce back in 2025 expected to retire in 5 years. The scary part is that the median age of the local government workforce is age 45, and half of those people are 50 and above. So you can see what's coming and what's actually upon us. Um, we have found so many of our clients talking about, and the survey data bears this out, recruitments get reopened. We experienced this in recruiting for different positions in BerryDunn in our local government practice group, where we hire directly from local governments. We've had positions that we've had have been open for several months. Our clients are telling us the same thing. We have a client that spent almost 2 years trying to hire a senior building official and ended up having to hire their previous one back out of retirement until they could fill the gap. Um, and the reported time from announcing the position to hire is just getting longer and longer. And I'm sure we're speaking to points here that you already are aware of. The point here is that skill-based hiring is a great response to that. And it's also getting more and more policy traction. So several states, including your own, Washington, have developed policies around this, encouraging skill-based hiring. You have an executive order that was passed recently and a very robust toolkit to help you with this that we're going to reference at the end of our presentation if you're not already aware of it. So this silver tsunami, we have to get ready to respond to it, and we have to respond to it in ways that are different than we have in the past. So the gaps are the deepest in these areas. This again is the same study that drew out the 5 areas where local governments are having a hard time getting qualified candidates in the door. In addition to this, we're hearing that not only are the recruiting times long and the many times the pool itself, the level of quality of the candidates is not there. Once they get them in the door, the turnover rate is really high. And Traquillia is going to speak directly to this because you can't just think about the hiring process alone. You have to think about what you're putting in place after the person is hired. You have to think about how you've even thought about this position in your organization and how it's going to be strategically used, not just currently, but in the future state of your organization. And if that hasn't been thought through, that's when the revolving door cycle happens within these very hard to fill positions, particularly in these 5 areas. So what do we have here? So this is the beginning of the solution to this problem. It's getting over what we call the credential trap. And the way that we're defining this credential trap is that you have a common lens that you've probably been looking at candidates through over the years. We've just tackled this in our own company, BerryDunn, where we started to rethink how we're posting job descriptions and what we're really recruiting for. It's very easy to get caught into the trap of we're going to look at a person's resume and we're going to track their career arc and their position arc to the title of our position and get caught looking at a candidate through the lens of the position titles that they've held. And that is a false lens because what the title doesn't necessarily tell you is, does this person really have the skill set that matches the position you're recruiting for as you're envisioning it for now and the future? So there's a great need to bust that open, that you can start to open yourself to looking at people who maybe have non-traditional or non-linear career arcs, who maybe don't have a one-to-one match for your position title in their resume, but that have skills that are an absolute match for what you need, based on the very diverse experiences that might not look identical to what you're used to. If you get too caught up in that lens of the traditional career arc, oftentimes you're overlooking really experienced and candidates that have skill sets that are a great match, such as veterans and people who have maybe been in caregiving roles and have maybe been in caregiving roles in their home environment in the recent history, which could translate into some public health positions, and that have gone through different types of career changes. I, for one, have a very unique career arc that was unique when I held government roles, and then eventually, even as I became a consultant, that career arc has been unique. So my resume looks very different on paper. The thing is that if we get caught into the mindset of hiring people like me, which is kind of an unconscious thing that we can easily do, we hire people like yourself, or you hire people that are like your other team members, you end up with homogenous teams. And then you're artificially narrowing your talent pool, and you're also recruiting for what you already have, not for maybe some of the skill gaps that truly do exist, and thinking about what the future needs of your organization are going to be as the needs of your organization change and as job requirements evolve over time. So to set the stage for Traquillia to take it for a little while from here, skill-based hiring kind of breaks you out of that mold. It actually looks at competencies that the role really needs and allows you to look at capabilities instead of getting mired in the titles that people have had. And the ultimate goal that you want is to have a more diverse and adaptable team that can adapt to what is an increasingly volatile environment to work in, and can also serve your thoughtful needs about the future and filling in for gaps that you truly have. So here we're going to go to a quick, this isn't a poll, it's really more of just a question and asking you to either drop into the chat or unmute. What is your biggest, most pressing workforce challenge right now? Who would like to share? What are you struggling with? Is it getting positions filled? Is it the retention? Is it the succession planning? Is it the reskilling? Is it all of the above? Who would like to share?
I'll share.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer.
So I would say it's certainly all of the above. I work for a county, and um, but I think if we were prioritizing, it would be developing people for leadership and succession. Um, and then the reskilling of current staff for evolving roles,
Mhm.
because technology is changing things. And so what are we doing to help folks that came in 10 or 15 years ago and didn't need to know how to operate certain things that, with new technology, they're needing to do that. And developing people for leadership and succession, right? It's like focusing and investing in the staff that we have,
Mhm.
and finding the time to be able to do that, because like with local governments, there's always way more to do than what we have resources to do them in. But that critical prioritizing is really important. It's a challenge.
That's Jennifer, thanks for sharing that. Both Nicole and Angie put C, Vanessa put C and D, so they're definitely in agreement with you. Nicole wrote in the chat, Jennifer, thank you. That is well spoken. I I think Jaquilia can speak to this more deeply than me, but I focus on overall enterprise strategic planning with our clients. So doing end-to-end strategic planning with our city and county government clients. And this comes up, the C and D comes up in every single strategic planning engagement that we've done. And we've done about 60 of them in the last 5 years. So that's a long track record of hearing this very same need that you've articulated across our work in that period. Does anyone else want to offer their perspective? If not, we'll move on. Okay. Feel free to drop some more into the chat, and Traquillia, I think she's going to keep going here.
Yep, thanks for that. Jennifer definitely hit the nail on the head as it relates to succession planning and rescaling and so forth. That is an absolute need within how we look at talent development moving forward. And so we'll touch on that a little bit deeply down the line. But as we look at some of the approaches to just getting started with that, a lot of that starts around retooling how we begin the process. So beginning that process, sometimes we have a job description that's already existing, and we just kind of pull from that job description, repost it, and see what we get, right? So we want to move away from that and really identify what is it that we need here? So what do, aside from the last person who was in this role, the habits that they probably had that may have been great or maybe a little bit traumatic. So how do we move away from kind of those nuances that impact how we approach the rehiring for this role? We look at what is it that we need to really identify competencies and needs for your team, the team of that department, for the organization as a whole. Back to what Michelle mentioned around strategic planning. So some of that strategic planning comes from your organizational mission and so forth. How do we tie all of those moving pieces in together and kind of map that to what actually is necessary as it relates to the skill for that particular role? And as we begin to really audit all of those moving pieces, sure, some of that credentialing comes into place where, the degree typically will create a foundational expectation around what we have assumed that that person has gained in their educational experience, their educational career, and then their work experience. So we look at their resume. So we see some of what we anticipate from someone's experience, or that we would like the experience that we would like them to have based on this role and the competencies that's needed for the department, your organization, the kind of gaps that are within the team, what some team members are doing well, where we have some disconnects, what we need for the longevity of the team dynamic. We want to look at all of these moving pieces and not just pull random qualifications into what we would, have for a role, a job description. So we just want to be more intentional about that. And then as we start to build on these competencies, build on these experiences, then we look at, okay, how do we now ensure that we're able to identify these the competencies? How do we identify the degree and experience? What will help us to really just develop the protocols around removing away from those biases and having something that's concrete that will help us gain what we would need in terms of performance expectations and predicting that. So sometimes that could be some assessments, and especially as it relates to kind of your financial roles, some operational roles. So we have mechanics and operations, what should they be able to do, and what assessments are necessary to help us then develop those? Any type of screenings that will help us really hone in on those skill sets. And even as we look at, critical thinking, are there some assessments that we can put into place that can help us identify that this person has the mindset that can create that kind of adaptability to the competencies that we would need for said role? And then moving away from kind of some nepotism, we find it sometimes in government and nonprofit and so forth. A lot of times, because of our resources or lack of resources, what Jennifer mentioned, sometimes we kind of lean on who we know or someone who knows this person and is kind of willing to jump in and help us out a little bit. But we can start to create partnerships within our community that kind of build this all together. We have our local colleges and schools that are trying to build up these competencies within our communities. And so it's kind of a give back in a way. And a lot of people who are in public service really come into public service because they want to give back. They want to do, a job well back to their community. So it's kind of building up that pipeline within our, veterans programs and so forth. So just really connecting the dots to empower our community. So looking at it from a different perspective. Anyone here? Any questions, thoughts here for anyone? I'll pause. Okay. And so, when we talk about, those competencies, and like I mentioned around even the community pipelines and so forth, we are coming in with those good intentions of ensuring that we are making a promise to our community that, hey, we are recognizing that, you have the competency, you have the skill set. We're going to help you continue to drive that. This is their this becomes their training ground. And so that's where we start to shift from just focusing on the credentialing and then working on some of that development to help people feel connected within that, with especially, again, back to service, public service and so forth, feel connected within the organizational approach to hiring. And so a lot of times when we don't have these things in place, we definitely have an opportunity to kind of stop and get stuck in that space. And so we don't want to do that. We want to keep moving. When we look at, oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say a quick question before we leave what you were just talking about. Jennifer posted in the chat, can you share a couple of examples of assessing for critical thinking, which you were talking about in the previous slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for that question, Jennifer. So critical thinking a lot of times comes from your behavioral interviews, right? So when we look at the assessments around the tools that we use to be able to identify competency levels, skill sets, and so forth, we can create, whether that's specific to that role, whether it's kind of back to that operational mechanics operations, or when we look at kind of manager development and so forth, I think a lot of that comes from really creating behavioral questions that will answer a lot of the moving parts around whether someone has an understanding of the nuances that come alongside of, navigating a particular challenge with a team member, of a peer, their any other kind of leadership connectivity. So it's really the behavior questions that we put in place to be able to gauge whether or not someone can respond and how they respond.
Yeah.
So that's part of your interviewing process. So just having something that's in place that, yes, we can assess this person can do the job, they could do the job well, but let's talk about whether or not how they respond to the challenges that they've had in place. What has their experience been like?
A real concrete example of that. So behavioral questions. Yeah, thumbs up on that, Traquillia in the chat. A real concrete example of that would be you could even identify a problem that your you as a city or a county went through, like a real sticky problem that was an actual real problem that somebody had to solve, and ask them how they would approach that so that you can immediately start to assess those critical thinking skills. And those questions came up a lot in interviews after the COVID pandemic because there were so many wild things that had to get addressed and that had to happen that had never been done before, that kind of opened up the gateway to behavioral questions that could tease out, critical thinking capabilities. But yeah, asking people to noodle through a very specific problem that could come up or has come up in that particular environment is a great way to do that.
Yep. See another hand. Is that a hand there?
Yeah, so I started coughing right when you called on me. To kind of add to that too, I think an important lesson that I had to learn is when you ask those behavioral questions and when you pose those scenarios, the answer doesn't have to be the right answer. Like that's what we train when we hire you. The answer is, did this person just like knee-jerk answer? Did they think about this? Did they come up with things that maybe we hadn't thought of or we had thought of but took a lot of work to get to that response? So that was just a lesson I had to learn like on my own kind of the hard way. So just to add to your very good points about those types of questions.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks for that additional feedback there, Samantha. Yeah. And I don't even think that there is a quote unquote right answer. So I think it's to your point, really identifying whether or not the person has thought through and thoughtful about their approach to the answer. What does that look like for them? Because your approach, everyone has a different approach to how they handle, various scenarios. So does that approach match your organizational expectations of navigating various situations? And even if you push back in that scenario, if you present something, their approach is maybe a little off, and then you push back a little bit and you say, well, what if this? And then what if that happens? And then they respond, how they respond to it can also give you some assumptions as to how they would even navigate just leadership dynamics, employee dynamics, and whether or not they became defensive in that response, or whether or not they just really adjusted and went along and were able to navigate the conversation easily. Anyone else? All right. So why development fails? So when we think about development, we have some development programs. We have departments that will come up with a learning and development, you know, team or a department and so forth. And sometimes that consists of some trainings, a compliance module here, new hire training, OSHA training, all of these kind of check the box requirements, right? So it becomes transactional and it doesn't really connect to anything. So it is just, again, back to that one-off. It's something we have to do. So a lot of times that's what happens with the failure along most of these steps. When we look at even onboarding becomes transactional. We think about, when we hear the term onboarding, most and even the employee themselves would think about new hire paperwork. So think about I-9, a W-4, their direct deposit. That's when you hear the onboarding, that's what they think about. Versus what it takes when we try to onboard and bring someone into an organization to help them feel comfortable, to help them feel a part of the organizational mission, and have a strong understanding of their role, just kind of that retention component. So when we don't have those things, we have a lack of connectivity to the, promotional system, your compensation and so forth. So employees really, again, they don't necessarily connect the two. So we want to make sure that it's not transactional, but it is a system. And once they're in, and even as a manager themselves, sometimes we have managers who do the job well. They're promoted for doing what they do, naturally are able to do well. But they haven't been developed in the things that we would want them to have some development in terms of how they manage people and so forth. So a lot of times when we hear the term manager, that does create a connectivity to the people management scope of work. And so how do we move away from the individual contributor who is doing well versus people development and so forth? And even if it's not people, a development of skills and ownership of a specific scope of work. How do we move away from the fact that they're just doing the job well, but having the instinct of really owning, creating ownership, and developing them within the expectations of what it takes to be a leader versus their instinct, really giving them the tools to be successful in that. So quick open discussion. When we think about the people within our organization, or wherever you've been connected to, or people that you've watched along the way, when you watch them grow into a world, or in their role rather, what is it within the organization that you feel made it possible for them to be successful? feel free to drop it in the chat, raise your hand, and present openly. Whatever works for you, wherever you're most comfortable. Samantha.
We have a really good, our administrator is super supportive of like kind of letting us guide our own path in our careers. And so as we find training opportunities that we think that would be good for us, he encourages supervisors and as a supervisor himself to like really allow that to happen. So we have a lot of autonomy about what we want to do with our programs. And we're trusted that like that fits with our mission, vision, values. And I mean, there's discussion that happens, but I can't think of a time that I've heard any supervisor or the administrator turn down a training opportunity for somebody who's found something on their own, and vice versa. If he finds something, he'll send it and say like, "Oh, I think this would be really good for you in your program. Like, think about it, let me know." So I think just that support of being trusted that we do have the focus of our agency individually is really important.
It's a good one. Thank you, Samantha. Anyone else?
I'm seeing posted in the chat encouragement from their manager, autonomy, real-time feedback, and formal training opportunities approved. And then invested in training, providing roles on projects outside of their specific functional area. So those are both great examples.
Yep. Those are great examples. And one of the things that that you actually did, Samantha, was you kind of hit the nail on the head of what we anticipated your response to be. A lot of times when we think about the manager or the experience, someone who was great and helped us grow or helped us develop, a lot of times we think about that person rather than the organizational capability, right? So, or even the manager's capability within that. And so what if you had a manager who didn't know how to develop you, the right questions to ask, the resources to present to you, who to go to ensure that you were able to get what you needed, to identify where there are some gaps within your own work. What if they just expected you to get it done and for you to figure it out? And they, again, didn't know kind of the right questions to ask to help you along the way. And so one of the things that we know and data has proven to us is that employees sometimes when they get stuck and they're having a hard time within their organization or things get rough and they don't feel like they have the support, they're leaving because their manager is not able to give them what they need. And studies have proven that people are not being, we talk about promoting, we have the managers who are being promoted for doing things well, but not necessarily able to move towards development. When we talk about what it looks like for a manager to be able to create a supportive system within their team, they haven't necessarily had the development. They haven't moved that along. They haven't created some leaders within their teams. They're just getting the work done. So back to that succession planning that Jennifer mentioned earlier. So when we don't have someone who's intentionally creating the tools that someone needs, that would need to be able to take those same skill sets and move it throughout the team dynamic, it kind of lives and dies within that one person. Identifying some of again, those gaps that are within the team dynamic. So again, not just doing the job, but where are we faced with challenges within our team? How do we ensure that we're not pointing people out openly when things are going wrong? Are they able to navigate that to have a team that's still encouraged to do the work to get things done? And they recognize when things are getting challenging, and then they are able to pull them aside, have the conversation, identify what's necessary to move them forward, Just navigating that people component. And that's not always, an instinct for a manager. A lot of times that has to be developed and develops over time. Um, and then when we look at just that overall talent strategy, back to the earlier program when we were talking, or the other part of the slide when we were talking about the components of developing that job description, the competencies and skill sets, so forth, that are needed for our talent strategy. That manager is the one who's driving that. So if they're not aware of all of these nuances around the gaps in the strategic dynamic of the team, and how that maps back to the organizational development component, a lot of the driven identities that we look for, if they're not able to see all of these moving points, bring that into our team dynamic, develop the team in that way, then a lot of times we're stuck with the ROI where we have high turnover in a team. So this next slide is just a bit of data. So it's data here where we start to, this was presented by Bamboo HR. This was done back in 2005. And Bamboo HR is an HRS system where, a lot of employers use these systems for your recruitment, a lot of the HR kind of management tools and so forth. And so they did a survey to really kind of get some new data on what's happening now, what's happening. This has been a long drawn saying around that the driver of organizational turnover is within the management component. So we're looking at almost 50% of why employees are leaving organizations being a management concern. So whatever that looks like within the management concern, whether it's some micromanagement, inconsistent leadership, communication, unfair treatment, just kind of all of these moving pieces that are impacted within the team dynamic of management and development.
And could I just add one thought here, Traquillia? These are all things that are within your control, most of them, right? You can improve communication skills. You can develop your managers in such a way over time, and particularly if you're recruiting for these competencies, right? This is within your control to solve a lot of this. And some of it can be solved before you hire anybody into a management role in your organization.
Any thoughts here, anyone? Thoughts or questions? All right. So we'll move right along. We've been mentioning, I know you've heard me say over and over again, kind of that system approach. So, we don't want to just focus in on that one training, that, harassment training, your compliance training. Sure, yes, those are necessary. We need to get those done. But as it relates to development, and especially within the manager component, we definitely want to ensure that we are recognizing that it's not, something that just happens, right? So we would like to ensure that we have capable people who you would naturally put into the right environment, but unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So how do we create a space where we are being very intentional about that? And so we've talked about some of that organizational clarity. So big picture, we have the strategic plan that's across 3 to 5 years. We have that in place. We have that mapped out as to what the organization has, what expectations the organization has across our departments and units and so forth. So that's the big picture. Now we start to move that down into our roles. So we start to get a little bit more granular. We look at those specific roles that, again, putting the person out of the picture. This is just the role specific to the role. How do we start to create some connectivity there? How do we take that big picture of expectations for that department, whether we want to, create some a new program within the department, if we want to start to develop some training components that help our fire department, be more responsive within a certain timeline. So how do we, what is impacting that? What is impacting that? Is it leadership? Do we not have the right connectivity as it relates to our timelines, the resources that we need? So if we need to have more in terms of our people count, so how do we really start to nail that down, and how do we connect that into the expectation? And then the manager capability around that. How do we ensure that managers have the specific skill sets to manage the people so that we don't have that high turnover that we mentioned? And then if we start to develop all of these things, the expectations around that, we have our succession start to weave itself and develop in its own way. So that's the purpose. That's where that manager capability is so pronounced within the system. If it is not there, it will start to break away. It will start to break away. You may have some components that are working. We may have a strategic plan that is starting to develop. We may have some expectations for each of those departments, but it will start to break away if we do not create all of the components that really, help our managers to develop themselves. Go ahead, Jennifer. See a hand there.
Yes, I'm curious. At least my experience within local government is that the classifications are developed and it's very functional, right? You're a subject matter expert. You kind of grow within that functional field, and maybe it crosses over into another functional field. But so you maybe move up the into the agency, like you move up in your positions and get promoted because of your technical competency, right, in that functional area. But doing the work versus managing people, like getting work done through others, is very, very different. And so as we're kind of looking at this, there's what are the people that are already in place that we need to work on? What are those development plans that we put in place for them? But also, what does it mean to be like a manager or supervisor within that organization? And like, because it's a huge, how do we start showing that? It's a huge, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, sorry. But it is something I've thought a lot about, because they get the opportunity because they're good at their job, like they're good at doing that work. Then they move into managing people or supervising people. It's very, very different.
Very different.
And most agencies, we're working managers, director, like you're doing both. So I don't know if you have any suggestions of how to do that.
Yeah.
I have a couple of initial thoughts, and I'm really taking this from more of a enterprise perspective, strategic planning enterprise perspective, and then having it cascade down right throughout the organization. Is really being intentional about starting the development of people much earlier after they come into the organization. Some portion of the people that you hire, either into entry-level roles or mid-level roles that aren't management roles, some of those people are going to need to become managers. And so how do you this is really the system that Traquillia is talking about. How do you create a development system that isn't just event-based training that starts to identify those people and build them earlier in their career arc in your organization so that they are ready for those roles. They're ready to supervise and manage people because you've started that process earlier. And one thing that can contribute to that, and we learned through that 2020 survey that I mentioned earlier, that only 12% of government agencies, either state or local, have a succession/workforce plan in place. And so you've got to be thoughtful about what you're moving towards. And if you identify a gap in management skills, then you can develop a plan for how to address that gap. So those are two of the first things that come to my mind when I think more of an enterprise strategy perspective. Traquillia, I'm sure you have some things to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think if I'm not mistaken, what I'm hearing from Jennifer, some of the challenges also, so that specific example that you gave, Michelle, would be for our teams that are coming in, right? So our new approach to teams that are coming in. And so when we think about people who are already in the role because they've been promoted through whatever that pathway is organizationally, through the function, being able to do the job well. What do we do now? They're already there, right? So they're already there. They're already doing the role. Perhaps there's some challenges. So having the tools set up in place, we've recognized that there are some challenges and some needs there. And so what we do is we, look to see how do we create, not just for this one person, but how do we, now that we recognize that this is a concern, we put some processes in place to be able to address our manager essentials trainings, right? So how do we ensure that they may have been in the job for 3 years now and they're still challenged with that. So now we create this program that is going to be a mainstay within the expectations of a manager, and we kind of push this person who has been doing this work for 3 years or more into some developmental training. And now it's not just this one person who's existing, but now we have a protocol for moving new hires through the same expectations. So we start to just move that along.
And that's connected to that. Traquillia, Samantha just posted in the chat. I love this. She says our county has an onboarding introductory period for anybody when they promote to a manager, where they train and they're given the opportunity to see if it's a good fit for both parties.
Love
That's that's a great idea. And Samantha's saying they're thinking about adopting that practice. I really like that.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a quick time check here. It's about 12:45. We got about 15 minutes left. So probably need to cruise along here so we can get
Yep.
through. But we love your questions and your perspective.
Yeah, all good stuff. Okay, turn it over to you.
Yeah, this is me. So closing the loop on all of this, we're going to try to bring all of this into some sort of practical action steps for you all. So skills-based or competency-based hiring, it just basically redefines who you're letting in. And then it helps you to just plan what to do with them and then whether they stay, right? It's like upstream focus, getting it right or more close to right on the front end is probably going to reduce your turnover in that roles and will be a determining factor on whether they stay or whether they go. So you need to kind of think of these things as not two separate initiatives, right? The hiring and the development. They are very interconnected. They have a common foundation. So it's a clear, shared definition of what the skills and competencies of what your organization actually needs are. And that's a piece that often gets missed in the day-to-day scramble, right? In the hiring and recruitment process. It's hard sometimes to take a pause and to move yourself up to that strategic level where you can really look organization wide and say, what do we really need? What are the competencies we are recruiting for? Getting that right on the front end is going to make all of this much better. You're going to be bringing in people into the organization that are starting from sort of a different level of capability and adaptability as you try to meet the needs of the current state and your emerging future state.
Yeah. Awesome. Great. And I'll just add here, we've talked about this, your questions already helped us cover some of these, the majority of this here about, how do we even start this approach? What does this look like? And so I think Jennifer's question around that, manager or what have you, who's already been there, it's so overwhelming to, we have a functional role who has progressed and kind of earned that through the doing, but then still needs some development. So how do we approach it? So we have a lot of moving parts. We have a strategic plan. We have all these nuances that impact what development should look like for our organization. So how do we just get started? And so I think just that one example, just starting there, we have a challenge. Let's work on this. Let's mull it over, look at the competencies, kind of map out those gaps, and just start to build on that, build on the pathway that will create the outcomes that we're looking for. And with that, we need to ensure that when we talk about especially readiness, we talk about that readiness that is from the organizational component, because when you start to introduce, especially in local government, or in government in general, you start to introduce some new approaches to work, you can get a little pushback. And so, how do we ensure that we're preparing everyone for change as we start to navigate different systems and expectations as it relates to performance? And I think just given the time check, we'll drive that along and just look at what we can do now. So I'll leave that, turn that over to Michelle.
Yes, so this is, and you can find some great resources to support this. We're providing at the end a link to that toolkit that came as a result of the state executive order, which, you don't necessarily have to abide by that, but you all can access that toolkit that the Office of Financial Management put together, which is really quite robust. And I'll share more details with that with you at the very end. But these are the practical steps that you can take. Take one job posting and audit it, right? This is how we started inside of BerryDunn, as we were actually in some cases competing with you. Trying to hire the best local government experts to come to work for our local government practice group, where we were really looking at our position descriptions and taking away unnecessary credential requirements, unnecessary things that would allow us to broaden our candidate pool and really try to describe the position and its importance by what success looks like. What is the outcome that we're hoping this position will be able to produce for our organization? So if you did that with just one thing, in this quarter, that would be a very tangible step that would start to move you down this track and start to get you oriented in looking at it from this perspective. Having one honest conversation. So talking with a single hiring manager on what it means to develop, and not just manage, but their team, but asking them the support they need to do it well. So we have a client that we just finished an enterprise-wide organizational assessment. It's a city in Oregon that identified their hiring and recruitment process as one of the core business functions that was failing the organization. And so one of the things we identified is that there was high turnover in the organization. It was for the reason that Traquillia was pointing out. The exit interviews were showing that. And so one of the recommendations that are now beginning to build is this end-to-end, starting with before the recruitment process, end-to-end system for identifying the skill needs, building that into the recruiting process, having a supportive onboarding process, and then developing people from the minute they walk in the door. And then finally, and so the start of that conversation is with the current managers in the organization to help build that. And then third, just like those positions, those areas, those 5 areas that we presented at the very beginning of the presentation, what's your highest turnover role or highest turnover area within your organization? And taking that one first, because it's your most vulnerable point, and trying to see if you can get some critical traction there first, and then having that permeate out into the rest of your organization and its needs.
Yeah. Wonderful. And so we'll just close out because I saw some questions and discussion. So we'll just move it along to a couple minutes, leave the floor open for some Q&A here. We did have a couple of questions that we thought about as we wrapped up about, kind of what resonated most within this conversation today. Where do you feel most stuck? And then what does it, mean for your community to just get this right? Your community, your organization, et cetera, just, overall impact. And the floor is open. Yeah.
Either chat or just open your mic and share. No hand raising necessary.
Whatever works for you.
I think for me, the biggest, it's more like prep is that silver tsunami, because we definitely, we have 10 people in our office and 3 of us are under 40. And there's quite a few that are going to retire all around the same time, which is going to make my life really, really exciting for we have like a really extensive interview process and screening process. And so being really discerning with like with your like this kind of guidance on what are you actually posting, what does this job need as far as competencies and your actually tasks that you need to be able to complete, as opposed to how much school have you had or what specifically have your other jobs been. And looking at, maybe it's not necessarily about, I mean, I'm in human resources. I have a degree in English. Like it doesn't, I come from working in education. There really was no, um, I left poor administration. I did not leave my job, right? Like kind of to your point, people leave managers, not jobs. And looking at, okay, maybe somebody has restaurant experience. Well, what kind of skills are involved in working in a restaurant that could apply to whatever position we're hiring for? And so just keeping these things in mind this has been really, really helpful. Is like, it's not happening in the foreseeable future, but it's happening within the next 5, 10 years. And I am not over 40 and I'm not retiring within the next 5 years. So this will be my responsibility. So it's just good to have a lot of this advice and information.
That's great. Thank you. While you're thinking and maybe formulating a question or a thought, I do want to just mention a couple of things about this executive order toolkit that I think is really helpful. So if you click on that executive order 2404 toolkit, some of the things you're going to find there, and it's pretty robust. You're going to find some actual skill-based hiring resources. They actually have some sample resources for some of the more common job classifications, some of which match sort of one-to-one from state to local government. I know you have some other very more specific functional needs, but there's some really good material here. They've got something called a skills engine that you can click on, and they have links to the the National Governors Association with some strategies for skill-based hiring in public sector in general. There's some more materials available through the Department of Enterprise Services with the state of Washington. So if you're looking for just some, practical resources to get started on some of this, I think that toolkit is going to be very useful to you. And we know that doing work all over the country, and we've done work for Washington and Washington counties and cities are some of our clients. We know from our positioning across the nation that Washington is ahead of the game on a lot of the sort of performance management thinking and sort of the innovation around process improvement. You're one of the leaders in the country. I live in Oregon, and we've been trying to catch up with you guys for years. But you can build off of that because there's a lot of great examples in your state that you can draw from to really give you some traction and provide some innovative tools for you.
Yeah, agreed. And I appreciate that feedback from Samantha. I also started in education, so and and moved along in human resources. So there's some connectivity there.
Yeah, I did too. I started my career in higher ed. So yeah,
there you go.
Yeah,
Traquillia and I aren't related, but we had some similar.
I know, right?
there's three of us in the office that come from education. One's 32 years in special ed. I'm in behavior special ed, so started trial by fire, a lot of violence, and then moved into behavior intervention. Like you come to me if you're kicked out of class. And then our other is she's taught high school math. And so we end up having a lot of bonding because there is so much overlap. There are so many skills that we learned from being teachers and aides that transfer to we have completely different roles in our office. So it's going back to that look for skills, not for background, is so important.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad that resonated with you. And over here at BerryDunn, we can also help with that. So we can help you, create some of those training protocols, manager development, system developments to help to make those connections through your organizational, investment and how you're connecting the two and how we look at the challenges and how they're impacting and just helping you create that system that makes sense.
Yep. We hired Traquillia for her background. She came out of local government also. And so we recruited Traquillia for this specific work. And we like to tie it to broader organizational strategy, obviously, but that whole like continuum from workforce planning all the way through to figuring out your performance management system to developing people is what she specializes in. So thank you so much for your time. We enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for being so engaged and participatory. It makes for a much better um, presentation and lunch and learn when that happens.
Yes, it was great. Appreciate all that feedback.
And thank you both so much for presenting. That was very engaging. I'm not in HR and I was still really intrigued. So thank you for such an engaging presentation. Someone had asked earlier about if the recording will be available, and we do intend to have that available to our members with the slide deck following the presentation. So keep an eye out for that. We may be able to put it in our newsletter coming up. It's just a recap so that you have access to those. And if you have questions, following this, Michelle and Traquillia are both very eager to connect with you and accessible. So I'm happy to help make those connections. Their information is on the slide as you see, and we still have them listed on our Solution Center on WASAC's website as well. So lots of ways to get in touch. So thank you everyone for your time, and thank you both for presenting, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.